Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So go to audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast. That's audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast to get your free audiobook today. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Dahr Jamail about the environmental destruction caused by the U.S. military's actions. Mr. Jamail spent more than a year as an unembedded journalist in Iraq between 2003 and 2014 and now writes frequently about the environment. He's won multiple awards for his journalistic work in Iraq and is the author of 3 books, Beyond the Green Zone, The Will to Resist, and The Mass Destruction of Iraq. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, The End of Ice. You can follow his work at dahrjamail.net. That's DAHRJAMAIL.net. And also at truth-out.org, where he is a staff reporter. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/military-environment. Dahr, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. So this subject sounds, pretty, it doesn't sound too ridiculous once you stop to think about it. If the U.S. military is going to have bases all over the world and be using bombs in various countries and be performing different types of war games, then it makes sense that some environmental destruction would follow. But I'm not sure that a lot of people actually think about this when they think about the U.S. military's activities. So can you start out by just giving a brief overview of the sort of environmental destruction that we're looking at here that U.S. military actions bring about?
Yes, it's the U.S. Navy. Let's start with the fact that they carry on ongoing different types of war game exercises wherever they operate all around the world. My articles are focused particularly on the waters off the coastal United States and up in the Gulf of Alaska, since most of our readership is United States based. But I think most people are going to be really, really surprised to hear the amounts and the types of things being dumped. I mean, if we start with a broad overview, the Navy, and this is all according to their own documentation, their own internally produced environmental impact statements, et cetera. And in the next 20 years alone, they plan to dump up to 20,000 tons of heavy metals and explosives into the oceans off the coastal United States. And so those materials will be introduced into the oceans by way of bombs, missiles, bullets. They sometimes sink entire vessels during their exercises. They'll bomb old ships to practice bombing runs and torpedoes. They'll also be introduced into the environment by way of batteries and electronic components and anti-corrosion compounds of those things as well, all of which go into the bottom of the seas. And also, according to their estimates, unexploded ordnance, i.e. duds, when bombs don't go off, which range anywhere, according to the naval documents, between 1% and 3% of their munitions turn into duds, and that's when things are going well for them. And then those types of things going into the ocean, they then release toxic chemicals, things on like benzene and cyanide and other types of chemicals as well, both from just using those types of munitions as well as when they fail and when they go into the oceans.
So what types of environmental destruction have we seen from these heavy metals and explosives being dumped into the oceans? Obviously, it sounds horrible, but how have we seen the natural habitats and marine life affected by this so far, and what should we expect to see happen as we see further dumping over the next however many years to finish out this 20,000 tons that you mentioned?
One of the more obvious ways to see this, and that has actually gotten some publicity in the past, is when the Navy uses certain types of their sonar. These are sonar that, for example, to give you an idea how loud they are underwater, Anything above 85 decibels is when we, as humans above water, start to experience hearing damage. And then the higher you go, the more hearing damage you're going to have. On up to around 140 decibels is when we start experiencing hearing loss, sometimes instantaneous. Underwater, for example, some of the sonar that they use is still at 300 decibels, hundreds of miles away from the source. So you see pods of dolphins, whales, and other marine life that are killed and then wash up on shore because literally their eardrums explode, and without eardrums they can't hunt, they can't move around underwater. And then other times it causes pods to flee, so you see these large beachings of whales and porpoises and sometimes seals and things like this. So that's one of the more obvious ways. A little bit more subtly, one of the stories I did focused on the use of depleted uranium munitions, which the Navy has left off the seabed off the Pacific Northwest coast, and then claimed that DU, i.e. depleted uranium, is just as safe as any other metal. And it's there in the form of spent munitions that they've used during their exercises. And it's actually located within a marine sanctuary. So that's obviously going to have negative effects on any of the marine life around it, everything from the smallest fish on up to seals and other marine mammals that go through the area that are then exposed to this radiation.
All right, so we'll return to this subject in a little bit and talk a little bit about what's been happening in Alaska and Washington State and off those respective coasts. But let's just take a step back here. When we talk about the U.S. military and the U.S. government as destroying the environment and as being polluters, how does that compare to what we see as far as environmental destruction and pollution goes from other entities and groups around the planet? Is it significantly more than we might see from, say, the Chinese? Is it less? How does that compare?
Well, I haven't seen any numbers out of China on that, for example. I mean, it's not something that I think would be very easy to find. I'm sure they keep it extremely classified. And the numbers that I'm quoting are directly from the Navy itself, and this is what they admit to. So I think, given my experience of reporting on the military in Iraq, is that when it's something that they're not very keen to have be made public, they tend to underreport what it is, whether it's the amount of toxins they're introducing into the environment or civilian casualties, et cetera. So I think my point being is I think it's safe to say that we're talking about probably substantially higher numbers than those that I'm quoting, but those that I'm quoting are, I think, shocking enough as high as they already are. And so if you look at the amount that the Navy is using in these waters, it's really quite shocking. I mean, they're by far and away the largest polluter on the planet. They're the single largest consumers of fossil fuels on the planet, even much higher than so many countries on the planet, and certainly any corporate power corporation on the planet. So we're talking about very extreme amounts of contamination that they alone are introducing into the environment.
No, it's just staggering the amount of pollution, the emitting of carbon dioxide, the level at which that's happening, the use of fossil fuels. It's just staggering. And by the way, I was not intending to signal out the Chinese government. I was just picking countries almost at random there for the sake of asking about comparisons. But I want to turn now to something that you're obviously very familiar with based on you having spent a lot of time as a journalist in Iraq, and that's the destruction from U.S. bombs, military operations in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. So just how destructive is that type of activity to the environment and the use of some of the chemical weapons and white phosphorus and depleted uranium that we saw there?
Yeah, it's extremely, really obviously toxic and having incredible human health impact. I interviewed, I'm not going to try to pronounce her name because I just know her first name, what she said to call me. She's an Iranian-American environmental toxicologist named Mozan, and she is the winner of the 2015 Rachel Carson Prize for her work specifically on DU and heavy metal contamination by the U.S. military around the world, and particularly in Iraq. So if you look at, for example, just the amount of the rate of cancer where the U.S. used depleted uranium munitions around the planet, around their bases, as well as when they've bombed. In Basra, for example, many times over has the incidence of childhood leukemia increased since the 1991 U.S. bombings that occurred there. And then again in Baghdad, and specifically in Fallujah, we're looking at cancer rates now that are upwards of 14 times higher than they were in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan during World War II, after the U.S. used nuclear weapons there. So we're talking about rather staggering amounts of cancer increases. And then we can go into the environmental impacts from the heavy metals, because the toxicologist that I interviewed for this series of stories that I'm working on, she talks about these dangerous nanoparticles of metals, even including uranium nanoparticles, she said, that are released into the environment. And then these add to an already escalated background rate of environmental contamination, and that these heavy metals and toxins specifically are contributing to negative impacts of neonatal development in babies. And this is obvious, very obvious in Iraq, where I've seen the birth defects firsthand, these nightmarish birth defects, babies being born, so many of them being born dead, to the extent that at one point in Fallujah, the religious and tribal leadership in the city actually advised women to stop having babies, that it had reached that bad. And granted, this is in a very, very conservative, religiously conservative place. So that was a rather shocking development. And I could go on, and I outline these in detail in this series of articles about the types of developmental problems that these types of contaminants are having on babies. And then, the final thought on that is that not just in Iraq, but when we introduce these into the environment, the air, the oceans around the planet, they spread around, and that becomes part of the background rate. And that's what this toxicologist warned, that we already have a staggeringly high background rate of contamination that's affecting babies before they're even born around the world, no matter where these types of materials are being introduced.
It's just staggering, and since you can go on and on and on, maybe I'll have to have you back on at some point so we can focus more on the spread of disease and the health effects for human beings and for children and babies that are caused by these weapons and heavy metals being used. But let's return now to the environment in particular, and let's talk about just what the environmental destruction looks like by U.S. military activities outside of the U.S. and outside of war zones. So what do we see there? Obviously, it looks like a lot of your reporting on this has focused stateside, but what do we see from U.S. naval and other military activities elsewhere that aren't necessarily in a war zone?
Right. There have been oil spills occur in their activities around the world, some off the coast of the UK. Just right off the top of my head, we've had, and then a lot of these same contaminants from, for example, they use these things called sauna buoys, which are basically buoys that are equipped with sonar that release a signal for X amount of time. It's usually 8 hours during their exercises, and then they're just left out there. And then these float for a while, and then they sink. They have batteries that then leach out lead, manganese, and other dangerous heavy metals like copper and nickel, and then sink down to the bottom of the seabed and stay there forever and keep leaching these things into the environment. And that's happening all around the world. It's not even necessary to really name a specific place, because literally anywhere that the Navy is carrying out any of their larger exercises, they're introducing, they're using these sauna buoys that have these batteries. They're using a huge amount of explosives in the forms of, bombs, bullets, missiles, torpedoes. And in the torpedoes and the propellant of the torpedoes itself as well as rockets, there is even cyanide at hundreds of times above levels that, of course, the EPA has said, they even actually have an allowable limit of cyanide in the environment, which is rather stunning. Yet the Navy's introducing it at levels literally hundreds of times above that, off the coastal U.S., but also around the rest of the world. So these are just a few more examples. And again, it's a very, very long list because they're using a lot of really, really nasty things out there that are chock full of heavy metals and other toxins that are being introduced into the environment.
Sure. All right. And before we focus in on Alaska and Washington State, where I know a lot of your reporting has focused, I just want to bring up the subject of the U.S. nuclear arsenal and the potential for significant environmental destruction from that. So what can you say about that topic, and what are your thoughts on the possibility of having severe environmental destruction from the U.S. nuclear arsenal? Not to mention, of course, the horrific possibility of wiping out large numbers of human beings as well.
Well, anytime these are being used, it's going to increase the level of background radiation around it. We have, in fact, there's at least two, probably a much higher number, but two that I know of off the top of my head, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. And Chalmers Johnson, a famous analyst and formerly with the CIA, and author who was very, very outspoken against the Iraq War. And he lived up outside of San Diego, and he warned that, hey, right off the coast here, nearby where I live, there's one of these nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. What if there's a mistake and it runs aground somewhere? You could literally have the possibility of a nuclear accident at sea. And then, of course, as we see with Fukushima, this goes directly into the water and then is spread eventually around the entire planet. So anytime they're using the depleted uranium in addition to the risk of one of these nuclear-powered aircraft carriers running aground or having an accident is always going to be problematic.
Sure, of course it's going to be problematic. And I'll mention that I did an episode on the U.S. nuclear arsenal and the problems with that and the arguments against it and in favor of at least reducing its size. So I'll link to that, of course, on the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/military-environment. But I want to turn our attention now to a part of the country that I'm sure you're very familiar with in Alaska and in Washington. So let's just focus on Alaska first. What have we seen as far as environmental destruction from the military in Alaska? What have we seen with the U.S. Navy and war games in Alaska in the Arctic region, and what do we see with toxic waste dump sites in Alaska as well?
In Alaska alone, on land, there are over 2,000 toxic waste dumps, contaminated waste dumps across the state. I mean, people always think, you hear the word Alaska and think it's this wild frontier, very pristine. But thanks to the military, it's actually, I checked the number, it's over 2,500 contamination sites across the state that they alone are responsible for. In fact, there's 6 Superfund sites across Alaska, and a number of those are military related as well. And then when we move on to the water, every other year, the U.S. Navy conducts what they call the Northern Edge exercises, and it's tied in with other branches of the military up there. But talking specifically to the Navy, again, when they do it, these are the exercises where they're permitted to sometimes sink entire vessels off the coast. And then again, using all the munitions I mentioned earlier, bombs, rockets, torpedoes, sonobuoys, underwater sonar, both low level and high level, that is causing major problems with the sea life up there. And then disconcertingly, a woman, Emily Stolarczyk, who's an environmental watchdog person for a group up out of Cordova, Alaska, who is tasked with basically working to protect the habitat of wild Alaska salmon. She's done her homework on this, and I interviewed her for several of the pieces I've written, because she warns that when the Navy does these exercises, they actually have launched, when they carried out the last one in 2015, they launched it on the opening days of salmon fishing season for the commercial fleet up there, which right off the coast in Cordova is the second largest commercial fishing fleet in the country. And literally in the opening days of the salmon fishery, the Navy launches their Northern Edge exercises out right in a lot of the areas where the fishing takes place. And so her and the fishing community there in general have fought against it, trying to at least ask the Navy to even switch their dates. And so far, the Navy has insisted, no, we need to stick with these dates. We're not going to change, despite the fact that they used to carry them out in the wintertime. And so right at the height of the salmon fishery, they're introducing all of the things that I mentioned earlier, including several tons, at least up to 5 tons of hazardous materials, like, as I mentioned, cyanide, but also cadmium and a lot of different chlorides and titanium compounds, lead oxide, ammonium perchlorate, all these other extremely nasty cancer-causing chemicals directly into the system, right where the salmon are going through, other fish that are in the commercial fishery are going through, as well as migrating marine mammals and bird life.
For you, as a listener of the Wake Up Call podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You can listen on your daily commute, while doing errands, or while running around town. And did I mention that you get one audiobook for free, regardless of whether you end up getting a paid subscription? Choose from books we've covered on this show, such as The Primal Prescription by Bob Murphy and Doug McGuff, Base Nation by David Vine, and The Problem with Socialism by Tom DiLorenzo. Or you can choose from any of the mysteries, science fiction books, history books, business and entrepreneurship books, or anything else that Audible has to offer. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast. Again, that's audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast. That's audibletrial.com/wakeupcallpodcast to get your free audiobook today. All right, and along those lines, can you talk a little bit more about how fishing communities and fishermen are affected by this, and some of the other ways in which we're seeing marine life as well as wildlife in Alaska and elsewhere affected by what's been going on?
I think, one of the biggest issues that people in Alaska are worried about is the fact that the Alaska salmon brand is the most important thing. That, people think, as I mentioned earlier, well, if I'm eating this salmon that came from Alaska, I feel comfortable that it's going to be very, very clean and not have any kind of environmental contamination in it. And the biggest risk is if a scientific study is carried out at some point and these salmon are found to have some of these chemicals and heavy metals that I just mentioned, then that brand is contaminated and that fishery would be at risk of collapsing. And, you don't need me to tell you how important the salmon fishery is to the state of Alaska and all the people in these fishing communities like Cordova, which is essentially, it only exists because of the fishing industry. And then we can say that about so many other places like larger parts of Kodiak Island, and then certainly going out the Aleutian Islands to Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, et cetera. So all of these would be are directly impacted by these naval exercises. So if those are contaminated, then that fishing industry collapses and those people just literally don't have jobs. That's a sizable percentage of the entire economy of the state of Alaska. And so they're very, very concerned about it. And this is why in 2015, I wrote my first story about these contamination issues up there. And a giant flotilla of fisher people out of Cordova actually made international news by going out and staging a protest in their boats on the water the day before the fishing season was opening for the salmon fishery. So they're, needless to say, extremely concerned about it, continue to be. And this is a very hot button ongoing issue across all the fishing communities in the state of Alaska. There's certainly been instances where some people are now warning up there, whether it's fishermen themselves or other advocates for them, that they're worried that the contaminants could already be in the fish and that it's just a matter of time before scientific studies are carried out and this could be exposed. And that's the big concern. I mean, they're trying to prevent that from happening. But there's also been, just briefly on some of the other impacts that I could comment on marine life, there's been several strandings of whales up there, sometimes more than one at a time, as well as marine life die-off, like some seal die-offs, et cetera. And specifically with the whales, Dr. Rick Steiner, he's an oceanographer and marine biologist, formerly with University of Alaska up there, and now continues to work as a consultant with the state of Alaska, as well as the UN and other countries around the world. And he's blamed specifically naval exercises for several large whale strandings and deaths up there over just the last few years.
Wow. All right, so let's move from Alaska to Washington State, another area where I know you've done a lot of reporting. What have you found in Washington State and off the coast of Washington along these lines?
Well, again, in addition to the depleted uranium that I mentioned earlier, of which there's tens of tons of it off just within the 12 miles of the coast, the western coast of Washington State, located within a marine sanctuary. I mean, that's there on the seabed, and the Navy admits itself, we can't get that back up. We're not even going to try. We also have the sauna buoys that I mentioned, as well as the batteries within those, and all of these are littered up and down the coastline of Washington State, where they've carried out these exercises. Even inland in Washington State, in Puget Sound, a very, very heavily populated area onshore, as well as using a lot of civilian folks, fishermen, sailors, et cetera, just using the waters. We have the Navy carrying out live weapons testing. So the use of underwater detonations, the use of firing missiles out into the water, which then explode underwater. This is a regular thing in these waters, both in the Strait of Juan de Fuca that connects Puget Sound out to the Pacific Ocean, as well as even further inside in different arms of Puget Sound, where they're literally carrying out live weapons testing and underwater detonations, to the point where because I live up on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, and several of our local papers, you'll find, we'll hear these underwater detonations. Sometimes they're large enough that people living nearby the coast even have their homes shake, and it's even reported in some of the local media.
All right, and I have to ask, while we're going from state to state, what sorts of activities have we seen in Texas along these lines?
You can find maps, again, in the Navy documentation, their training plans and environmental impact statements, where literally every portion of the entire U.S. coastland, from the West Coast to the Gulf of Mexico to the eastern seaboard, is available for some types of military exercises. And there's been complaints I've seen of even ex-Navy people who live in Florida who complain about the amount of jet noise traffic over their homes from naval planes flying overhead, being involved in some of these exercises, to a lot of the open water exercises in the Gulf of Mexico that would at times be permitted to carry out a lot of the same types of things that I've been talking about that happen up here in Washington State, and that have happened and continued plans for them to happen up in the Gulf of Alaska.
All right, so what sorts of laws are in place to prevent this sort of environmental destruction that we're seeing, and how much outcry and criticism have we seen? Because this doesn't seem to really be covered in the mainstream media in the U.S., and I'm guessing a lot of people aren't aware of this, but how much outcry do we see towards this type of activity?
Virtually none, which is shocking to me. I've been covering this story quite frequently now since 2014. And I am, every once in a while you'll see a story in that, there was the NRDC won a case against the Navy off the coast of Southern California and forced them to stop using certain types of sonar because they were able to show that it was literally killing a lot of the marine life down there, certainly larger things. And they won the case, and theoretically, the Navy's now not allowed to use that sonar in pretty large areas of the ocean off the coast of California and around certain parts of Hawaii. So that has made headline news at times over the last couple of years. But that aside, the types of things that I'm reporting and which is so easily available, it's right there in the Navy's own documentation. I mean, anyone can go online, and I hyperlink to all of this information in their documents within my stories, and I'm quoting them directly. And so because of that, it's literally like a story that's hiding in plain sight. And I think that the media, though, chooses not to cover it because, as usual with so many other things in the United States, the military and the Pentagon they're the sacred cow. There's all this fanfare. We must support the military, et cetera, as though they can do no wrong. And the problem is that they're largely exempt from a lot of the regulations that would apply to you and me. But in the name of national security, in the name of training and remaining battle ready, they're allowed to carry out these exercises and introduce literally tens of thousands of tons of toxic chemicals and dangerous materials into the air, and even more so into the oceans, from which we get so much of the seafood that we eat and do so much of our recreation, and they're basically getting a pass.
So are there any laws on the books regarding this type of activity from the military? I guess if there are, they're largely being ignored. But is there anything on the books there, or just nothing at all? And these regulations across the board only apply to you and me and not to them?
I don't know that. I don't think there's like an across the board regulation that would state, or a law that states the military is completely exempt from any of the U.S. environmental regulations. But I definitely am aware of quite a few instances where they are given a pass as far as I know specifically jet noise, for example. There's a federal law and state laws about what is considered noise and what is considered illegal to generate noise over, say, 75 decibels. It's actually a little bit lower than that, but just to be conservative, to say 75 decibels in a residential area where anybody lives. And yet regularly, right across the water from where I live, there's a community nearby, a naval airstrip, where people are regularly, a couple times a week, subjected to 130 and 140 decibels, literally on their front porch, 80 decibels even within their homes, where you have these F-E-18 Growler aircraft, the loudest aircraft anywhere on the planet, these warplanes that are flying directly over their houses. And again, obviously the Navy is not subject to federal and state laws that apply to you and I in regards to sound pollution, noise pollution. But and that's just one example. And there's several others if we talk about what they're allowed to release into the environment in these exercises that we've been discussing.
Sure. And are the arguments in favor of the Navy being able to do this, the arguments that are made in favor of this sort of stuff, is it pretty much just, well, this is a part of the U.S. Navy and U.S. military's training exercises, so they need to be allowed to do this? Does it pretty much come down to that and the same sorts of arguments that we hear in favor of U.S. military action around the world whenever those debates are being carried out?
Yes, for the reason you stated precisely, in addition to national security.
Okay, all right. So they throw in the national security reason there as well. All right, that seems to happen quite often.
It does.
But all right, so what can be done to stop this sort of thing? What do you view as some solutions to this situation? What can be done?
Oh, I hate that question.
I know, but I gotta ask it, as tough as it is.
I know you do, but I think the first step is awareness, because, like you mentioned earlier, accurately, most people just are completely unaware that this is going on. I mean, certainly if you don't live very close to a coast, you almost have no reason to be aware of it. But so I think becoming aware and writing letters to the editor and bringing that awareness to other people in your community that, this is a public health issue, and people need to be aware of it and know how to protect themselves. For example, they may not want to eat fish out of an area where the Navy's been conducting their exercises off the coast of where they live. So I think working to increase awareness, make it an agenda item for whoever your local and state representatives are, out here where I live, there's several groups that are engaged in community organizing, and there's even several that are working towards more lawsuits to be filed against them, because there actually have been some instances where there have been some successful lawsuits by some of the bigger environmental law groups in this country. So that is certainly possible. There have been victories. It's not an all is lost situation. Obviously, it's an extremely steep road to try to bring some kind of effective resistance against it. But I think right now, given what we discussed about the lack of media attention, I think awareness right now would be a really great place for people to start.
All right, well, that sounds like great advice. And if someone wants to increase their awareness on this issue and learn more about what's going on in regards to this issue, where would you direct them? What resources or articles or readings or books would you recommend they take a look at?
I publish my articles on truthout.org. I archive all of them on my website, dahrjamail.net. People can find them there. And then there's also an excellent group up here called the West Coast Action Alliance, that literally any and every document that the Navy has and analysis of those and exposés of what they are doing up to the day. That's a great resource to the West Coast. It's westcoastactionalliance.org.
Okay. All right. Great. And I just want to remind everybody to go take a look at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/military-environment. And that's going to be the place to go. In particular, if you want to learn more about these sorts of issues, because we'll link to dahrjamail.net and to Truth Out, and to the organization that you just mentioned, the West Coast Action Alliance, as well as all those books I mentioned in the introduction. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/military-environment is your one-stop shop for resources and everything related to this episode. So I encourage everybody to check that out. And I also want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher or another podcatcher of your preference, as well as to sign up for our email list. And that way you can catch all the episodes and make sure not to miss any. And I also, one last instruction for people, please give us a follow on Twitter at WUC Podcast. We'll be tweeting out the episodes as well, so you can stay up to date that way too. And Dahr, thank you so much for your time today and for joining me to take a look at a topic that largely goes undiscussed and unnoticed, and that's definitely a shame. So I'm glad we were able to shed a little light on what's going on with this, and hopefully we can speak again sometime in the near future.
I hope so. Thanks very much for having me.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.